The end of this year and the beginning of next year present special and daunting challenges. Congress must determine the fate of the Bush tax cuts, the alternative minimum tax, the dreaded sequestration, the Medicare doc fix, the temporary payroll tax cuts, and the extended unemployment benefits. These would aggregate about $8 trillion over 10 years. And in just the next fiscal year, the impact would be $400 billion. In addition, for the fiscal masochists in the room who want more, we're likely to be hitting the debt ceiling once again, and we can hopefully avoid the repeat of last year's nail-biter. All of these action-forcing events are conspiring to force action on the fiscal policy around the end of the year, and I hope that our elected leaders use this opportunity to put in place a longer-term comprehensive plan. It is clear we need to have a thoughtful discussion about timing. We are often presented with the phony choice of we either focus on the short-term economic recovery or we address our long-term fiscal challenges. I believe we can and must do both. Any measures to boost growth in the short term could be accompanied by longer-term fiscal plan that is not implemented until the economy recovers. One point I want to state absolutely and clearly. As policy changes are made, they must be made in ways that secure benefits for the most vulnerable so that no one fears that the social safety net is threadbare. One of the major reasons to avoid a crisis is that in a crisis, the politics could get brutal and the social safety net could get shredded. That would be unthinkable.
What we're trying to do is make sure that Americans recognize that as we restore gravity to our long-term fiscal position, we have to make sure we do that in ways that does not undermine recovery, does not set us back on this path to healing the damage caused by the crisis, and gives us the room and the ability to invest in things like education, human capital, infrastructure, better incentives for investments in basic science and research. Those are the things that we need to be able to grow and expand opportunity in the United States going forward. And if we are unsuccessful in doing those things, then our fiscal challenges over the long run will be much worse, much more difficult to manage.
Reform of this scale can't happen without the engagement of Americans. Everyone needs to be a part of this process so that together we can decide how best to build a future for our children and grandchildren. Recently, a team from our foundation went around the country and talked to Americans. You'll see several short videos throughout the day that demonstrate what they're thinking. In addition, as Pete mentioned, we commissioned a national survey that captured the views of Americans on a variety of fiscal questions. Our panel this afternoon addresses this question directly and will discuss how best to engage our fellow Americans in this important dialogue. It's essential that everyone understands the direct connection between debt and jobs. In many ways, the fiscal issue is the jobs issue, the jobs of tomorrow. Everyone in this room understands this, but how do we effectively communicate this to America? How do we explain the connection between reducing the deficits and creating jobs? It's essential that they get it. Without the support of the people, no real fiscal reform is possible. Even when the politicians finally agree on how to stabilize the debt, if the American people aren't on the same page, it won't last. So let's stop underestimating Americans and start including them in this process.
Actually, most people you vote for actually try to do what they say they're going to do when they're running. So the American people have got to take some ownership here too. Meanwhile, I think the politicians ought to be talking more about the hard issues. I think this budget issue ought to become front and center in the presidential election, in all the debates, in very specific ways. Our party's problem is we are always reluctant to give up the gains of the past to create the future. That's a different problem. But we have a lot of people in our party who will not be drummed out if they depart from the conventional wisdom. And I think you could put together sufficient Democratic votes to enact some variation of Simpson Bowles, or maybe even to do more. But the numbers have to add up, and it can't just be an ideological food fight. So if that's really what the American people want, they have to make that clear. And I don't know how they're going to make it clear before the election. So we need a magnet in the middle, and it is the process. It is the idea that a compromise is an honorable thing, and diversity of opinion actually only works for a society when you bring it into a process with people who do differ with you. Because you know something they don't, you've had experiences they haven't, and if you actually have to work through these things and say yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, you wind up with a product that gets you the right direction. That's the most important thing, and we got to do it on this debt. I'm telling you, if we don't deal with it, we will, sooner or later, someday or another, although we're dragging it out too much to suit me, have growth come back here, and interest rates will go up so fast you won't be able to catch your breath, and then everybody will say, why didn't we do this earlier? So we should have a considered plan now, but all of you have to make compromise honorable.
Javier talked earlier about some of the differences. We do have differences. I would disagree with some of his analysis, particularly the impact of the Bush tax cuts and where Republicans are on taxes and so on, and defense spending. But look, we can have those debates. We need to stick to the facts. And I think the fact is 24% of GDP in spending right now is historically high. We're headed toward, by the way, 30% under the likely scenario under Congressional Budget Office by 2030. This is unsustainable. We have to deal with the spending side. That is a fact. That's where we are. On the revenue side, it's relatively low. CB also says that once the economy picks up, we'll be back to the historic average. But my view is we shouldn't be arguing about Bush tax cuts. We should be arguing about tax reform. And this is an opportunity for us not to keep the current code and add more taxes on top of it, but to reform the code in a way that economists across the board pretty much agree would result in a better economic climate.
You got to jump in.
2 years before President Reagan's tax reform in '86, he worked with Congress to pass a deficit reduction plan. 80% of that deficit reduction plan relied on tax revenue to work. We can't get unstuck here in Washington, D.C. because of the word taxes. And there is no way you resolve the depth of this deficit problem without dealing with taxes. And that's where I think the difficulty occurs with well-intentioned Republicans and well-intentioned Democrats. And Rob sort of said it as well. He talked about getting our spending under control, and he talked about economic growth. I mentioned that, spending controls, economic growth, and I'm willing to say that you have to deal with the tax side of things. There's no way you can't. When the largest contributor to the deficits over the last 10 years have been the Bush tax cuts because they were unpaid for, you've got to deal with it. And then if you're going to deal with the spending component, the budgetary side, the appropriation side of what Congress does, the discretionary aspect of what we allocate to services and programs, and you don't recognize that 2/3 of all the new spending since 2001 has come in one department, the Department of Defense, and yet you've got a crew in the House who wants to spare the Department of Defense of any savings whatsoever, in fact, is willing to increase the Department of Defense, then that means you're going to have to load all the cuts to services to Americans and taxpayers, education, health, clean air, clean water, food safety, and you can't do it. And so if you're not willing to talk taxes, and if you're trying to load it all on domestic discretionary services, it won't work.
And the goal of this budget is not only to restore economic growth, to get our economy growing again, to get people from, collecting unemployment to collecting paychecks and paying taxes. Our goal is to get the trajectory of our debt on a downward slope, is to get the trajectory of the American unfunded promises, those empty promises, under control so that we can avert a debt crisis entirely. I would argue that over the last century, we had a remarkable consensus among both political parties, among the right and the left, on the government's role in helping provide the mission of advancing health and retirement security. But what we're now learning is that the way these programs were designed in the 20th century crash into a cold reality in the 21st century where these missions are no longer fulfilled because those empty promises become broken promises. A lot of folks who talk about having a balanced approach say just raise more tax rates, but don't deal with the structural drivers of our debt. Don't restructure these entitlement programs so that they can still fulfill their mission. If you don't deal with these entitlement programs in the profound structural ways in which we've proposed that have traditionally had bipartisan support, then you'll never deal with the trajectory of our debt.
I think the president has been doing an extraordinary job under very, very tough circumstances. And the reality is that the president put forward last summer a balanced plan. I know he did. I know a lot of the details that they put forward. They were willing to make some tough decisions, but what they're not willing to do is apply an austerity approach, which will slow down the economy. And what we will all insist on when it comes to the deficit reduction path is that it be balanced. We cannot have a system where we continue to provide another round of tax cuts to folks at the very, very top, which only increases the deficit and has not, and the evidence is pretty clear, it did nothing to boost long-term economic growth. That's a failed strategy. Why would we want to go back to that? So no, I think the president has put forward a very reasonable plan to address this issue. As Paul said, this will be central to the debate in the campaign this fall. I just hope that when those campaigns are over, we're able to put together the pieces in a productive way, because we have to deal with this as a country.
How is it affecting the decision-making of you and your peers at the top of corporate America?
The reason we got started in this, because we got a company to run, is that we started asking ourselves 3-4 years ago, how are we going to plan for the next 10? And I think that's what good business people do. So we sat down and we said, what's the outlook? And the best we could get to was that if we didn't do anything, it'd be awful. And if we actually acted, it'd be difficult for a few years, but it'd get better. And I think, and I do speak to other CEOs, until there's some clarity, and by the way, I don't think that there's any one solution. I think there's 50 solutions to this. The only one that doesn't work is the one we're doing now, which is nothing. Until there was some clarity, most business people are hunkered down. We're trying to figure out how to run our businesses so in a sluggish growth environment. I don't know the difference between +1 and -1, by the way, but in that kind of low growth environment, how does your business do as well as it can do?
And that means cutting costs to as close you can to the bone.
That's right. Doing more with less. How do you not put more people to work and manage until the economic outlook in the intermediate term? Look, I recognize the fiscal cliff in January 1, but that isn't how you run a business. You run a business looking out over the intermediate term. And when you look at that right now, until you see some action and a plan to make it better, it just looks $70 billion round numbers in bonds. And I never believed for a moment that a maturing treasury bill or a bond wouldn't be paid. I never believed it. But boy, we run the place. What if we're wrong? What if we just whiff on one? So in the week before, we actually raised $500 million of cash. And I mean initially cash, and we went to 2 banks, which I found very funny. We did enough cash flow work to know that if in fact we were wrong, we could run our business for 30 days on that cash flow.
Many members of Congress are very much out of touch with what's really going on back home. They live in a very closed circle environment here, and this is all about point scoring. And who's up, who's down, who's going to cut the next ad, who got the soundbite, who's going to be on the 6 o'clock news, who's going to be on CNN, who's going to be on MSNBC. Mayors don't have time for that. I can't debate whether or not I'm plowing snow. You either did it or you didn't. I mean, this is a daily test that we go through. Our budget is balanced. Theirs is not. I can't spend more than I have. I have a capital budget. They don't. The federal government does not have a capital budget. They just wait for stuff to break, and then they send somebody to fix it. How can you run a government with no capital program and no idea going into the future of how you're going to spend and plan? I mean, you just have to have the courage to do the right thing. I mean, it appears, some in our profession worry so much about keeping their job and whatever's going on in their heads that they are blind to the 15 million plus folks who don't have one. I think every survey has shown that Democrats, Republicans, Independent, Tea Party, Libertarian, whatever you want to be, everyone is calling for compromise. Unfortunately, 500 some folks here, I think, are not really listening because they're talking amongst themselves in a room, and this is our thing, and we've got a position, and we've got to maintain it. But we reduced the size of the government by 1,600 people. We cut back overtime in the police department by 30%. Crime kept coming down. People would not stand for massive cuts, certainly in public safety. They were not going to stand for massive cuts in programs that affect children or seniors, our most vulnerable populations.
How bad is the situation right now for us?
Well, one only has to look at what's happening in Greece today, what's happening in Spain, much less Portugal, Ireland. I can go down the long list, where they've waited too long. And as a result, the markets are going to dictate what happens there. And their ability to solve their own problems has all but diminished. And so as I look toward the end of this year, there's no reason for Washington to just kick the can down the road, where we put the next election in front of the next generation. We've got a serious problem coming at us. But I'll say this, regardless of what happens in the election, the electorate will take care of that. The next 2 years could be the most consequential 2 years we see in Washington and have seen in the last 50 or 60 years, because these problems are not going to go away. And we can't cut our way to prosperity, nor can we grow our way out of the problem. I think there are three big components that we need to embark on if we're serious about solving this problem. Well, one, we need real economic growth. To get real economic growth, we've got to reform our tax code, as I said, both personal and corporate. Lower the rates, make it fairer for everyone, and we need to get the regulatory juggernaut in this government off the backs of the private sector. The third component is we've got to do something about our spending. Today, we've got 10,000 baby boomers retiring every day. That's 70,000 a week. That's 3.5 million people this year. And this is just the beginning of the baby boom bubble. So this is going to go on for the next 20, 25 years. And that's why it's so important for us to begin to solve this problem. For 20 years, Washington hadn't done much. And we've waited almost too long. The sooner we get on this problem, the sooner we solve it, the sooner we'll be finished with it. Listen, everybody knows what the menu is. It's just a matter of having the guts to choose things on a menu.